Before the P-51 Mustang became a legend of the skies, it was dismissed as an underwhelming aircraft by the very pilots it would later terrify. In the early stages of its deployment, Luftwaffe aces watched the Mustang struggle above 15,000 feet, gasping for altitude, and concluded it was nothing more than a mediocre mud mover. These pilots, hardened by years of aerial combat over Europe, had grown accustomed to judging planes by their climb rate, firepower, and agility. The Mustang, at that moment, seemed to fall short on all counts. They had flown against Spitfires over England, Hurricanes in France, and the nimble Focke-Wulfs defending German airspace. To them, the early Mustang was just another aircraft, not a threat that would someday dominate the skies. American bomber crews, meanwhile, were suffering devastating losses. The famous Black Week raids had left an indelible mark on Allied morale. In just one mission, 600 men were killed as American bombers faced overwhelming German fighter opposition and dense anti-aircraft fire. The gap in fighter protection at high altitude had become deadly. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, where many bombers operated, the old Allison-powered Mustangs simply couldn't keep up with experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Crews began to fear that every mission might be their last, and commanders knew that something had to change. Even among Allied pilots, the Mustang initially struggled to inspire confidence. Its Allison engine limited performance above 15,000 feet, and many early reports described it as sluggish compared to other contemporary fighters. Pilots wondered whether it would ever be effective against the elite German pilots that patrolled the skies over Europe. Meanwhile, intelligence reports received similar reports. Luftwaffe aces, many of whom had survived hundreds of sorties, dismissed the Mustang as harmless. They laughed at stories of its long-range potential, convinced that no new American plane could significantly change the balance of power. Designers in the United States, however, were quietly engineering a transformation that would turn skepticism into fear. The British Merlin engine, adapted for the Mustang, dramatically improved its speed, climb rate, and high-altitude performance. Suddenly, an aircraft that had been underestimated became capable of flying higher, faster, and longer than almost anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. Pilots who had once scoffed would soon face a very different reality. The transformation was more than mechanical, it was strategic. The Mustang now had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, closing the infamous gap of death that had cost hundreds of American lives. While the Germans dismissed it, Allied pilots were preparing to unleash the Mustang's potential. Long-range escort missions became possible, giving bombers a chance to survive deeper into enemy territory. Its sleek fuselage and laminar flow wing design allowed it to slice through the air with unprecedented efficiency. It could dive faster than many German fighters, turn tightly enough to challenge them in dogfights, and maintain endurance that allowed continuous escort for hours. At low altitudes, it might have seemed average, but above 20,000 feet, over the smoke-filled skies of wartime Europe, it was a different beast entirely. The story of the early Mustang is also a story of perception and misperception in war. Engineers, strategists, and pilots all viewed it differently. To the Luftwaffe, it was a minor nuisance. To Allied bomber crews, it was barely a lifeline. Only a few forward-thinking officers, both in the US and Britain, recognized that this plane could become a game-changer. Intelligence reports often failed to capture its full capabilities, and German pilots continued to fly missions unaware of the storm approaching. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the air war over Europe forever. Pilots who once laughed at the Mustang would soon face hundreds of these silver aircraft roaring like a tide of metal over Berlin, their Merlin engines giving them speed, power, and endurance unmatched at that point in the war. Every maneuver, every dive, every burst of gunfire would become a lesson in aerial dominance. The first chapter of the Mustang's story was one of doubt, skepticism, and quiet preparation, but the seeds of revolution in the skies were already sown, hidden in plain sight until the day the aircraft would finally reveal its true power. Even before that fateful day in March 1944, the Mustang's impact was quietly being felt. Engineers continued to refine its systems, mechanics improved maintenance routines, and pilots practiced long-range tactics that would soon become standard. What seemed like a minor, unremarkable aircraft was steadily being molded into one of the most feared weapons of the air war. And while the Germans continued to underestimate it, history was preparing to make them pay for every misjudgment. By the time the Mustangs appeared en masse over Berlin, skepticism had turned into shock, but that story belongs to the next chapter. For now, the early Mustang waits quietly in the wings, underestimated, misjudged, and silently preparing to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. Its legend would not be immediate, but it would be inevitable.
March 1944 marked one of the deadliest periods for the Allied bomber crews in the skies over Europe. Known among airmen as Black Week, a series of devastating raids left hundreds of young men dead and countless planes destroyed. In a single mission, 600 lives were lost. These were not just numbers, they were sons, brothers, and friends, ripped from their lives in moments of fire and smoke as formations of B-17s and B-24s were torn apart by coordinated Luftwaffe attacks and dense flak defenses. Every sortie was a gamble with fate, and the skies themselves seemed hostile, a gauntlet that few would survive unscathed. The gap of death was the term Allied pilots used to describe the stretches of airspace where they had no fighter cover. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, bombers were exposed to German fighters with near total impunity. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, Focke-Wulf Fw 190s, and Ju 88s patrolled these heights with deadly precision. Experienced German pilots, many of them aces with hundreds of missions, exploited every weakness. Their tactics were brutal, coordinated attacks from multiple angles, focusing on the vulnerable points of the bomber formations. Flak from the ground created a deadly curtain of shrapnel, turning the sky into a three-dimensional battlefield of fire, smoke, and falling metal. For American crews, the psychological toll was immense. Young pilots, some barely 20 years old, faced these missions knowing that survival was not guaranteed. They clutched their controls, eyes scanning the horizon for enemy fighters, ears straining to detect the slightest drone of approaching aircraft. Each mission brought a sinking feeling that this might be the day they wouldn't return. Gunners reported incoming attacks, radio chatter crackled with tension, and every salvo of flak was a reminder of the peril above. The early Mustang, with its Allison engine, could not yet provide a solution. Its range was too limited, and it struggled above 15,000 feet, leaving the bombers unprotected for large portions of their journey. Intelligence reports confirmed the grim statistics. Bomber losses were unsustainable, and a new strategy or technology was needed to change the tide. Commanders pored over mission debriefs, analyzing every factor, from formation integrity to anti-aircraft placement. They realized that even the bravest crews could not survive without long-range fighter support. The human stories of Black Week are particularly striking. In one account, a young bombardier described seeing two of his comrades' planes hit almost simultaneously. Smoke enveloped the sky as they spiraled downward, and he could only watch helplessly, gripping his seat as explosions echoed around him. These incidents were repeated across multiple missions, each reinforcing the need for change. Engineers, pilots, and commanders understood that technical innovation alone was not enough. The aircraft had to be integrated into a new operational strategy. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, confident and seasoned, maintained control over the skies. They flew in coordinated packs, often attacking in waves, exploiting gaps in the bomber formations. Their communication and tactics were precise, and they had learned to anticipate Allied maneuvers. Even the bravest American crews admitted that at this time the Germans seemed invincible. Black Week was a reminder of just how high the stakes were and how deadly air combat could be when one side had the advantage. Despite these losses, hope was not entirely gone. Engineers and designers in the United States worked tirelessly to refine aircraft that could finally close the deadly gap. Long-range escorts were conceived as a way to give bombers a fighting chance, and pilots trained relentlessly in anticipation of these new machines. The Mustang, though still limited, was quietly undergoing transformation. Its Merlin engine would soon give it the speed, climb, and endurance needed to survive and dominate at high altitudes. Every day, as new reports arrived from the front lines, planners calculated how these upgrades could shift the balance of power in favor of the Allies. Black Week also revealed the critical importance of coordination and strategy. Bombers often arrived over targets separated from their fighter escorts, making them easy prey for Luftwaffe aces. Tactical lessons were learned at a high cost. Formation gaps had to be minimized, timing of escort deployments adjusted, and flak counters improved. Each loss provided grim data, each return to base a moment to reassess and plan. The Allies were learning quickly, adapting to the harsh realities of sustained strategic bombing in enemy territory. The experiences of these missions were etched into the minds of everyone involved. Pilots described the horror of watching friends fall, the roar of engines in dogfights, and the deafening crackle of anti-aircraft fire. Ground crews worked around the clock repairing damaged bombers and sending them back into the inferno, aware that each plane was a fragile lifeline for the men inside. The stakes were real, the danger constant, and the need for a solution urgent. Amid all this chaos, the concept of a long-range escort became more than a technical improvement. It became a lifeline. The P-51 Mustang, still underestimated, was being quietly modified to meet this need. Engineers, test pilots, and strategists understood that closing the gap of death could change the entire air campaign over Europe. The stakes were no longer theoretical, they were life and death, measured in the hours of flight, the range of engines, and the skill of pilots on both sides. By the end of Black Week, it was clear that something extraordinary was about to arrive. The Mustang, once dismissed and overlooked, would soon appear in numbers capable of challenging the Luftwaffe directly over Berlin. What had been a period of despair and heavy loss would become the turning point in the air war, but only for those who survived to witness it. Black Week was more than tragedy. It was the crucible in which Allied air tactics, technology, and resolve were forged. It set the stage for a dramatic reversal of fortune, a reversal that would shake the Luftwaffe to its core and redefine what was possible in the skies above Europe.
The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned cold and clear over Berlin, but for the Luftwaffe, it would soon become unforgettable. German aces had grown used to their dominance in the skies, confident in their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. They had watched the early P-51 Mustangs struggle at high altitudes and dismissed it as nothing more than a mediocre mud mover. Few imagined that an entire formation of these aircraft, now powered by the Merlin engine, would appear in overwhelming numbers to challenge them. As the radar stations lit up with incoming aircraft, Luftwaffe Command initially underestimated the threat. Reports came in of large formations approaching, but they assumed it was another bomber raid or a small escort squadron. The scale of what was coming, a staggering 209 P-51s, was beyond anything they had seen. These were not the early Mustangs struggling above 15,000 feet. These were Merlin-powered machines, sleek, fast, and capable of sustained high-altitude flight, ready to escort American bombers deep into enemy territory. For American crews, the mission carried a mix of fear and hope. After the devastation of Black Week, they had learned to expect the worst. Every engine roar, every shadow crossing the formation could be a threat. Yet the arrival of the long-range Mustangs brought an unprecedented sense of protection. Pilots who had flown countless missions over Europe now had machines capable of matching and even exceeding the performance of German fighters at altitudes where losses had previously been catastrophic.
The Mustangs arrived over Berlin like a silver wave. Hundreds of engines roared in unison, filling the sky with a power and presence that the Germans had never encountered. Their formation was precise, disciplined, almost mechanical, as if choreographed to strike fear into any observer. Luftwaffe pilots, once confident in their superiority, now faced a sky filled with machines that could match their speed, climb, and maneuverability. The first moments were chaotic, a mixture of disbelief and sudden realization. The war in the air had changed forever. German aces quickly assessed the situation. Pilots who had fought in hundreds of missions understood the significance immediately. These were not ordinary aircraft. These were long-range fighters capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, reducing the vulnerabilities that had caused massive losses. Every maneuver the Mustangs executed demonstrated their superiority: tight formation flying, coordinated attacks, and unmatched speed. For the Luftwaffe, what had seemed like routine air defense suddenly became a desperate challenge. The Merlin engine made all the difference. Unlike the early Allison-powered versions, these Mustangs could operate at high altitudes without gasping for oxygen. They could climb rapidly to intercept German fighters, dive with precision, and maintain energy throughout dogfights that previously favored the Luftwaffe. Every German pilot in the sky quickly realized that the aircraft they had once mocked were now among the most formidable machines they had ever faced. Air combat that day was a mix of awe and terror. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs attempted to engage, but the Mustangs' speed and maneuverability allowed them to protect the bombers effectively. Gunners in the B-17s and B-24s reported for the first time in months that they could focus on their targets rather than constantly watching for enemy fighters. The psychological effect was immediate. Confidence replaced dread, and morale soared among American aircrews. From the ground, Berlin's anti-aircraft batteries fired desperately, attempting to engage the incoming formation. Flak shells filled the sky with explosions, but the Mustang's speed and evasive maneuvering minimized losses. Observers described the sky as a metallic dance of speed and firepower, with silver Mustangs weaving through black bursts of shrapnel, protecting the bombers like guardian angels. For the first time in months, the Allies had the upper hand in the air, if only for this critical mission. General Adolf Galland, a Luftwaffe ace who had survived countless battles, witnessed the spectacle with disbelief. He had seen air superiority tilt back and forth, but the appearance of 200 Merlin-powered Mustangs over Berlin was unlike anything he had experienced. He later remarked that it was clear the war was slipping from their grasp, a sentiment that had quietly spread among German pilots. They had underestimated the Mustang, and now they were paying the price. The coordination between the Mustangs and bomber formations was flawless. The escort fighters flew ahead, beside, and above the bombers, ensuring that every vulnerable angle was covered. German pilots attempted to break formations using their traditional hit-and-run tactics, but the Mustang pilots were prepared. The results were dramatic. Bombers reached their targets with significantly reduced losses, and many Luftwaffe fighters were forced to disengage, unable to match the new aircraft in sustained combat. This day also marked a turning point in strategic thinking. Allied planners realized that long-range escorts could now penetrate deep into German territory with minimal losses. The Mustang had solved a problem that had plagued them for years: the deadly vulnerability at high altitudes. With these aircraft, the gap of death that had cost hundreds of lives during Black Week could finally be closed, and American bombing campaigns could continue with greater confidence and effectiveness. By the end of the mission, the impact was undeniable. Luftwaffe pilots, aces, and rookies alike were shaken. For the first time, they faced an enemy that could challenge their dominance in the skies over Berlin. The psychological blow was immense. Planes that had once been dismissed as mediocre were now unstoppable at high altitudes, fast, agile, and coordinated. The arrival of the Merlin-powered Mustangs signaled a new era in the air war, a turning point where Allied air superiority was no longer just a hope, but a tangible reality. The
The story of March 6, 1944 is not just about technology, but about timing, preparation, and bold execution. Hundreds of American pilots flying in unison had changed the course of the air war in a single day. German pilots who had mocked the Mustang could only watch as these planes dominated the sky, protecting bombers and rewriting the rules of aerial combat. It was a dramatic, almost cinematic moment in the war. The underestimated had arrived, and the consequences for the Luftwaffe would echo for months to come. Even as the Mustangs departed Berlin and returned to base, their presence lingered in the minds of both sides. American crews knew they now had the tools to survive missions that previously seemed suicidal. German pilots understood that the age of unchallenged dominance in the skies was over. And somewhere above the city, in the roar of Merlin engines, the air war had irrevocably changed. The Mustang had arrived, and with it came a new hope and a new fear for all who looked skyward.
The sight of hundreds of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had ever experienced. German aces, who had grown accustomed to dominance in the skies, were stunned. They had dismissed the early Mustang as an underpowered nuisance, a plane that could not operate effectively at high altitudes. They had seen the Allison-powered versions struggle, and they believed that American fighters could never threaten them in significant numbers. But now, the air above Berlin was filled with the roar of Merlin engines, silver wings flashing in perfect formation, and the reality could not be ignored. Pilots scrambled to intercept. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s took off from nearby airfields, their experienced crews anticipating an easy engagement. Yet as they approached the Mustang formations, the first shock set in. These were not ordinary escort fighters. The P-51s moved with speed, precision, and coordination that outmatched anything the Luftwaffe could anticipate. Their climb rates allowed them to gain altitude faster than German planes could respond, and their long-range endurance meant they could stay in combat far longer than any expected. Every maneuver was calculated, every attack anticipated. The German pilots quickly realized that tactics which had worked for years were now obsolete. Hit-and-run attacks on bomber formations, once highly effective, were now met with swift countermoves from Mustang pilots. The American fighters could dive, climb, and turn in ways that made traditional Luftwaffe interception patterns ineffective. Aces who had survived hundreds of sorties began to feel the unfamiliar and uncomfortable sensation of being outmatched. Every dogfight revealed a new capability of the Mustang: speed, maneuverability, range, and firepower combined in a way that few German pilots had ever seen. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's most famous ace, observed the unfolding events from command centers and reconnaissance reports. He had spent years in the skies, surviving against Spitfires, Hurricanes, and every bomber escort the Allies had deployed. Yet when the reports of over 200 Merlin-powered Mustangs streaming over Berlin reached him, a sense of dread took hold. He understood immediately the strategic significance. The P-51s could escort bombers deep into Germany without breaking formation or running out of fuel, effectively neutralizing the Luftwaffe's once dominant interception capability. Galland's own words would later echo the sentiment shared by many pilots on that day: "The war is lost." It was not bravado, nor despair at a single mission. It was the recognition of a tipping point in the air war. The shock rippled through German fighter units. Veterans who had survived hundreds of missions now flew with a mixture of disbelief and fear. New recruits, inexperienced and already under pressure, were forced to confront an enemy they had been trained to dismiss. Their formations, once precise and confident, became chaotic. Pilots struggled to maintain coordination against a foe that could match them in speed and climb while maintaining superior endurance. The sky above Berlin became a battlefield where German dominance, once absolute, was suddenly questioned with every passing second. As the Mustangs escorted bombers, German pilots attempted to mount attacks, but the results were devastatingly clear. American fighters defended the bombers with efficiency and discipline.
Every attempted interception was met with countermaneuvers, and the Luftwaffe found themselves being outthought as well as outfought. German aces reported being forced to disengage repeatedly, unable to gain the advantage even with superior experience and knowledge of local terrain. The psychological effect was immediate. A sense of uncertainty and vulnerability began to replace the confidence that had defined the Luftwaffe for years. The news of these encounters spread rapidly across German command structures. Intelligence reports, radar stations, and pilot debriefings all confirmed the same unsettling reality. The Americans had developed a fighter capable of neutralizing their once dominant tactics. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could no longer rely on experience alone. Technology had shifted the balance, and the skies over Berlin were no longer a safe domain for German pilots. The very aircraft they had mocked now dictated the tempo and strategy of air combat. In the air, chaos and adaptation collided. Some German pilots attempted to use new formations and high-speed dives to counter the Mustangs, but each tactic revealed the aircraft's superiority. The Mustangs responded fluidly, protecting bombers while maintaining cohesion in the formation. Pilots who had prided themselves on tactical ingenuity realized they were facing a plane that required entirely new thinking that could not be developed overnight. Every encounter reinforced the grim lesson. The era of unchallenged Luftwaffe air superiority was over. Gallant, reflecting on these events, understood the long-term implications. It was not simply about one raid or a single engagement. It was about strategic parity, about the Allies gaining the ability to strike deep into German territory with bomber formations now protected from the deadly attrition that had previously defined air campaigns. Morale, logistics, and the very sense of inevitability in air engagements had shifted. Where once the Luftwaffe had inspired fear in enemy pilots, now it faced fear itself. Even among lower-ranking pilots, the realization spread like wildfire. Encounters with the Mustang forced them to fly more cautiously, to question every maneuver, to recognize that experience alone was insufficient. Veteran aces felt the unusual tension of uncertainty, the recognition that a single miscalculation could mean death against an enemy that was faster, stronger, and seemingly everywhere at once. The psychological effect was compounded by the knowledge that these aircraft could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin, eliminating the protective gaps that had allowed the Luftwaffe to dominate for so long. This moment over Berlin became a turning point, not only in tactics, but in perception. The Mustang had shifted the narrative of the air war. Where previously German pilots had scorned American aircraft, now they faced a foe that demanded respect, attention, and adaptation. Every sortie reinforced the same lesson. The balance of air power had changed, and the Luftwaffe would have to respond or risk irrelevance. By the end of the day, German pilots were exhausted, frustrated, and deeply aware of the implications. Morale was shaken, and even the most seasoned aces knew that the presence of hundreds of Merlin-powered Mustangs had changed the nature of the air war. The sky above Berlin, once a domain of German control, was now contested in a way that would never be the same. From that moment on, the tide had begun to turn. For the Allies, the day was a triumph. Bomber losses were reduced, crews felt protected, and air strategy could now be executed with greater confidence. For the Luftwaffe, it was a wake-up call. The era of unquestioned dominance was over, and German pilots would spend the rest of the war facing an enemy that could match and often surpass them in skill, speed, and endurance. The shock over Berlin on March 6, 1944, would be remembered as the moment when the Luftwaffe realized that the air war had irrevocably shifted, and the once dismissed P-51 Mustang had become the instrument of that shift.
The appearance of the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang over Berlin was not just a remarkable technological achievement, it marked a decisive turning point in the air war over Europe. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies, shaping the outcome of battles and instilling fear in Allied air crews. Their fighters were agile, their tactics refined, and their aces experienced. But the Mustangs changed everything.
They transformed the strategic landscape by giving American bombers protection throughout entire missions, reducing losses and allowing the Allies to strike at the heart of Germany with unprecedented confidence. From the very first mission, the impact was clear. Bombers that had once been sitting ducks, exposed to flak and fighter attacks during the long journey to Berlin, now flew under the vigilant cover of the Mustangs. The long-range capabilities of the P-51 meant that for the first time, the bomber crews could focus on completing their mission rather than surviving each leg of the journey. Fuel constraints, altitude limitations, and previous weaknesses of escort fighters were now irrelevant. The P-51 could accompany bombers all the way to the targets and back, and German pilots could do nothing to stop them. The psychological effect on the Luftwaffe was profound. Experienced aces who had flown hundreds of missions and dominated enemy fighters for years found themselves outmatched. The lessons of the past, tactics that had brought them success in countless battles, were suddenly obsolete. They had underestimated the Mustang, and the consequences were devastating. Fear replaced confidence, hesitation replaced aggression, and morale began to erode in a way that had never been seen before among German pilots. Even the most decorated aces knew that the air war had entered a new era, one in which the Allies had the advantage. On the Allied side, the impact was equally profound. Bomber losses began to drop significantly. Crews who had been traumatized by Black Week could now operate with a sense of security they had never known. Pilots and gunners gained confidence, morale soared, and the efficiency of bombing campaigns improved. The P-51 allowed the Allies to implement long-range strategies, hitting industrial targets deep inside Germany that had previously been out of reach. Every successful mission under Mustang escort reinforced the realization that air superiority was no longer a distant goal, it was a tangible reality. The strategic consequences extended far beyond a single raid. With the Mustang providing continuous escort, Allied forces could plan large-scale bombing campaigns with minimal interference from German fighters. Production facilities, transportation networks, and military infrastructure became vulnerable targets. The Luftwaffe could no longer simply rely on superior skill and tactics. They needed new aircraft, new engines, and new strategies to counter the Mustangs. The pressure on German industry increased, the strain on pilots intensified, and the window of opportunity for the Luftwaffe to maintain control over the skies began to close rapidly. The appearance of the Mustang also shifted the balance of power in morale terms. Allied pilots felt empowered, German pilots increasingly demoralized. Stories circulated of bomber crews completing missions that had previously seemed impossible, returning home with minimal losses. At the same time, German pilots and commanders watched helplessly as formations they had once considered inferior executed maneuvers with precision and dominance. This psychological shift, combined with the physical superiority of the P-51, set the stage for the final phases of the air war over Europe. The P-51 Mustang's impact was not limited to its speed, range, or firepower. It was also about timing and coordination. Allied command used the aircraft to orchestrate complex missions that combined long-range bombing with precise fighter escort, overwhelming the Luftwaffe's capacity to respond effectively. Every engagement highlighted the aircraft's versatility. It could chase down German fighters, protect bombers, and operate for hours over hostile territory without the limitations that had plagued previous escort fighters. It had become a force multiplier, transforming individual sorties into highly coordinated operations. Historians often point to March 6, 1944, as the day the air war fundamentally changed, but the lasting impact unfolded over the subsequent months. The Luftwaffe's losses mounted, experienced pilots were killed or forced into retirement, and new recruits had to face an enemy that outperformed them at nearly every turn.
The Mustang made deep strikes into Germany feasible, reduced bomber attrition, and forced the Luftwaffe to spread its already thin resources even more thinly. By changing the dynamics of aerial combat, the Mustang directly contributed to the erosion of German air power and the eventual Allied victory. The story of the Mustang is also a story of innovation and adaptation. Engineers, designers, and pilots worked tirelessly to refine the aircraft, introducing improvements that maximized performance and reliability. Every engagement tested the limits of the plane and its crews, and every success reinforced the lessons learned in the skies over Berlin and beyond. The Mustang was no longer just a plane, it was a symbol of Allied ingenuity, persistence, and the ability to turn the tide of war through a combination of technology, training, and strategy. By mid-1944, the impact was undeniable. German commanders knew that controlling the skies was no longer possible with existing resources. Morale across the Luftwaffe was shaken, while the Allies could plan operations with greater confidence and precision. The P-51 Mustang had closed the gap of death, reshaped the air war, and forced the Luftwaffe to operate defensively for the remainder of the conflict. Its appearance over Berlin was not just a moment, it was a turning point, a signal that the balance of power in the air had shifted irreversibly. The lasting legacy of the Mustang extends beyond its technical specifications or even its battlefield accomplishments. It represents a pivotal moment in the history of aerial warfare, where preparation, innovation, and courage combined to create an aircraft that could not be ignored. It proved that even the most dominant force in the skies could be challenged, and it reshaped strategic thinking on both sides of the conflict. The Mustang became more than a machine. It became a symbol of hope for the Allies and a source of fear for the Luftwaffe, a force that would be remembered long after the war was over. Ultimately, the P-51 Mustang's appearance over Berlin was not just a victory in the air, it was a declaration that the Allies had gained the upper hand. It changed the trajectory of the war, protected thousands of lives, and gave American air crews the confidence they needed to press their advantage. For the Luftwaffe, it was a stark realization that the tide had turned, and the era of German air supremacy was coming to an end. The Mustang had arrived, and the air war in the skies would never be the same again.